wondered how cultural nuances can make or break a deal? If you're in a high stakes meeting with a client from one part of the world, how do you know if they value subtlety and harmony versus directness and enthusiasm? How do you adjust your approach? I'm Maria Garaitonandia, here with my friend and colleague Mona Lucharkawi. We're the Global Gals. And today we're here with Dr. George Simons, an expert in intercultural communication and negotiation. I'm happy to tell you that Dr. Simons moderates the CTAR, that's the Society for Intercultural Education, Training, and Research, the CTAR LinkedIn discussions group on competences in intercultural professions, and that connects with 17,000 members worldwide. He's also got a wealth of experience from teaching negotiation skills to the Asian Development Bank to creating the award-winning game series Diversify, which you can see on its background. Dr. Simons hopefully will be able to give us some tips and tricks on the importance of negotiating across cultures. So George, thank you so much for being here with us today. You and I have frequented a lot of similar circles in the last couple of decades, and the world seems to be shrinking and shrinking thanks to technology, and it permits us to reach people in more parts of the world. So I guess I'd love to start by asking you, what do you think are the biggest challenges that people are facing in doing business or negotiating across cultures?
Well, first of all, I think we need to look at the situation of the world we live in and the fact that us versus them distinctions are being paraded all over the place. We have this phenomenon we call populism, and we have politicians feeding the differences between people and the non-acceptance of others. Now, the challenge here, I'm an interculturalist, you're an interculturalist. The challenge here is for us to realize that interculturalists have this tendency to be conflict adverse. We don't like conflict. And what's most important, and this is what I'm telling my intercultural colleagues at this point, is that we need to learn conflict resolution rather than sidestepping conflicts, being afraid to confront situations and enter into them. So what we need are the kind of skills that help us do that. And of course, negotiation skills, whether we're talking about getting your teenager to come home on time on Saturday evening, or you're talking about negotiating a deal in the United Nations or Congress or whatever, there's a wide range of conflict resolution skills. But there are some things that we need to be very, very interested in and delicate about. And one of the things that I learned you mentioned that I had worked for the Asian Development Bank in Manila for quite a number of years doing negotiation workshops for their people. Now, their people were representatives all over Asia and Oceania. In other words, they were dealing with myriad cultures. I would have 8 dozen, 16 at the most people in one of my workshops. And it was rare that 2 of them came from the same country. And it was rare that they were working in the same countries. So one of the things I had to do was ask them, what happens when you are negotiating? Now, this is about negotiating with leaders of countries or officials in countries around development banks, grants for infrastructure and building and so on and so forth. But the sequence of negotiation is basically the same, though what you use in it will differ. So one of the first things I did was I had them brainstorm with me what happens at the different stages of a negotiation. First of all, how do you prepare for a negotiation? What kind of information do you gather about the person that you're dealing with? Whether, as I said, it's your teenager or head of a government. What's the relationship and how do you enter into it in such a way that you have the information you need to get started, as well as you are ready to make an introduction to the group or person that you're negotiating with? So that's step number 1. How do you set the scene? And of course, I had them brainstorm all of the kind of things. I have enormous lists of things that they experienced in preparing for a negotiation and preparing their opening statements. Then the next thing that comes along is, what's your position? Be home by 1 a.m, or, we would like to buy X number of your products at XXX price. Now, immediately, there's a whole mess of things that happen here. If you're dealing with people in Switzerland, you may open at about 5% difference from what you want to get. If you're negotiating in Saudi Arabia, you may start at 200% higher or 200% lower, depending whether you're buying or selling. And then what this does is it sets a norm whereby you need to explore. What does the other person need? What do you need to get out of this negotiation for it to be a success? Now, of course, my motto about this is definitely about win-win negotiation. In other words, I'm looking at situations where we can negotiate successfully and carry out the negotiation and perhaps continue to do business further. But at any rate, once you've got the two sides opening positions, how do you fill the gap? Well, you don't fill the gap simply by bargaining. Bargaining is a form of negotiation, and it depends on how people bargain and want to bargain. I have a very good friend who was in a bazaar in Morocco, and he saw this lamp that he liked. He looked at the lamp and he looked at the guy and he says, "How much for this?" And the guy gave him a price, and he said, "Okay," and pulled out his wallet. And the guy looked at him and he said, "I spit on your money." In other words, there was needed to be exchange, relationship, development of the negotiation, and then the price would go one way or the other. So we need to be careful about that sort of stuff. What kind of preparation is needed for that? How many dinners do you have to have before you start the negotiation, or you just walk into the room and say, boom, here we are? These are cultural differences. And so in the opening, you need to say, okay, what can be expected in this culture or this situation? If I say be home at 1, I don't mean 2, or, how firm is your negotiating position and so on. Once you're there, then there's exploring how do you connect across the difference. And the key to this is, what do you need and what does the other person need to get out of this negotiation to be satisfied? Now, that's really tricky because you may not know all the needs. You may not even be aware of your own needs sometimes, and that's some of the preparation you need to think about. What do I really need to get out of this negotiation? But for example, we look at needs. And one of the people that I had in the negotiation course in Manila was working with the head of a government, and this head of the government, they seemed to have the perfect agreement about the amount of things and so on, but nothing was happening. Then the negotiator for the bank discovered that this head of the government was up for election. And in the next meeting, he said, well, we seem to have a pretty good deal here. If we get this deal, we will really tell the press how important it is and what you've done to create a solution here. Bingo. He bought it. People have more needs than is expressed in, I'll give you 200. No, I want 150 or whatever, Uncovering the needs is very much a question of what we learn in so many communication courses about how do you get information. And often you get information by the things that we do in what we call active listening. Active listening says, okay, so what you're telling me is that. I make it clear that I understand what you're saying or asking me. Active listening is asking for more. So what does that mean to you? What does that get for you? What would you like? Is there anything else that you need there? So those are the kind of questions that we lead into. And also we model sharing. So for me, the important thing here is, in other words, if the other person knows my needs and can fulfill them better, then it's very important that I not only listen carefully to research the other person's needs, but that I actually open myself up to, safely at least, expressing what the needs are that I need from this negotiation. So what happens there is the big part of a negotiation is this exploration of needs and what we have to offer to fulfill those needs. I mean, you may have a need for something that I can't fulfill, but I may have a connection or an idea about how that can be added on or found or whatever. Getting as much out front as we can And that's not easy. I mean, sometimes people are very close about that. Sometimes, if you do your active listening extremely well, it can move along very smoothly. Once you feel like you have the needs and you've come to an agreement about what each party is going to get, then there's the matter of admitting the agreement or making the contract, putting that together. And once again, I'm talking about it could be you and me doing a thing, you and your kids doing something, or a big company doing something. The point is that when we make the contract and share the contract and agree to the contract, it works, okay? And what happens is that there are cultures in which people throw in other stuff. I remember selling my house years ago to a Chinese American couple. They were still very Chinese. And so we came to a total agreement. And after we were just about ready to sign the agreement, and they said, of course, you're going to repaint the basement, right? In other words, adding on, topping off, and so on. Not an evil thing. It's just a tactic that's to be expected from somebody of a different culture. Okay?
Can I jump in there real quick, George? Because that just, you've mentioned a couple of things, like what does a sales guy in Morocco expect from me? What does the Chinese couple expect from me? When I do that opening offer, how do I know that I'm not turning somebody totally off by going 5% versus 200%? What do you suggest to somebody before they put their foot in their mouth or screw up a negotiation from the get-go?
Thank you for mentioning that, because Dr. George, if you didn't know, I am from Morocco, originally from Morocco. So I know the spiel, and I know the haggle and how it works. Sometimes I fail at it as well. To make things simplified, I would say first of all, we have to understand when we are going into any type of negotiations, and negotiation is basically, like Dr. George said, problem solving. There's no conflict. You're just trying to find a solution. Well, finding the solution, we have two ways of doing this. Are we leading it from the context point of view or the content? The content and the context. If we have the content, okay, am I dealing with someone that will bring me a contract, and I'm bringing my lawyer, for example, if we're dealing here with the United States, bringing the lawyer has already done their work. They cooked that contract. They spent a lot of hours working on that. And that person is coming in with their lawyer or with the contract. Here's a contract. These are the terms. This, that. And if I'm working in the capacity of content perspective, then I do understand we are bound by that contract, and time is money. If I am dealing with contracts or negotiations, I do know that if I'm trying to save time, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. First, I have to go in with the mindset of building relationship first, and it may take me a year. And it just happened to me. I am in the real estate sales, and I came to culture through the sales perspective and leading cross-cultural teams. It took me 3 years to close a sale or negotiate to finalize this agreement between our company and the client, who was from Taiwan. It took 3 years. So how did I approach that negotiation? How did I approach that deal? I approached it from the context viewpoint. So that is somewhat extremely important to understand beforehand. And I let Dr. George elaborate on this, but I just want to make sure that we are making it as simple as possible to the viewer, because it's impossible to go out there with 250 to 290 countries with 5,000 languages, and we are trying to basically blanket, this is how you do this is how you do that. It will be impossible. And a lot of writing, there has been fantastic writing throughout the past years. And I was talking to Maria that a lot of these writings and findings, they're from academia perspective. So when we go out to just like the theory and the practice, the theory says one thing, and then the practice is quite different, because there are a lot of elements that we have to take into consideration. And those are the pitfalls that I'd like to touch on. And I will let Dr. George elaborate on what Maria said.
Well, context is extremely important. In the intercultural field, we are now framing our understanding of culture in line with what neuroscience is telling us about how the brain works and how we make decisions. We make decisions based on our identity, not on reasons. We say, that's me or that's not me. In other words, if you said to me, George, let's go hiking in the mountains, I would say, well, at age 87, I won't be able to keep up with you. It's not me. It's not me. Okay. Then you can give all the reasons you want to back that up. But fundamentally, we make decisions on the basis of our identity, which highlights what you're saying. And the fact is that we need to look at the context. Now, there may be endless cultures and endless personal deviations inside of organizations about the organizational culture. They're not just French, but they're this company called Alstom or whatever it is. What are some of the things that first of all, we need to do research specifically on the target, not just on the culture. The wonderful things that I want to say our predecessors like Hofstede and Hall and the other people who created intercultural stuff, these are still good hints of things to look at. But it's the culture which, according to Mai Gwynn, who's my favorite author in the intercultural field via neuroscience, has pointed out, is it's the context which determines what's going to happen. In other words, if you're going into a negotiation, it's like getting out of bed in the morning and getting ready to throw off your pajamas, and you open the closet and say, what am I going to wear today? Well, what happens is that when we're going into an encounter with people, we open the closet of our mind and say, who am I in this situation and who are they in this context? Now, there are things to ask yourself. If it's a negotiation, are you going? Who are you sending? Who are you taking with you? I had people negotiating in Brazil, and they brought 4 lawyers around with them, and the Brazilians were absolutely shocked that they need lawyers there. Okay, I've been in so many situations where people have an individual shows up and they're expecting a team. In other words, they only sent one person, or they sent somebody who's too young. So who you send or who you are sends a message already. Where are you going to hold this? Their place, our place, a neutral place? What does the place look like? I can tell you that the outfitting and size of a room will have impact on how people behave in a negotiation. So there's tons of things to look at, but the important thing is get as much information as you can about the negotiation. Some Japanese negotiators are very good at this, companies. They're dealing with an American, they even know the name of your dog. They research you personally as well as your organization. So it's a question of how much preparation you can do and what is the context demanding and how can you shape the context that will be comfortable for you and for the other people.
Basically, what I'm hearing is adjusting your expectations accordingly, because if you go in ignorant or thinking that things are going to be the way they are in your environment, and then you're in for a rude awakening. So yes, preparation is very important. Any ideas on how to set expectations properly as well? For example, if you're talking about the Brazilians, how do you set the expectations? Because maybe the people who came, they're like, oh, well, we want to save time, or we want to make sure nothing falls through the cracks. That might be my expectation. Whereas maybe for the Brazilians, it was like, my expectation is we need to get to know each other a little bit better, because I'm not sure if I trust you yet. And I'm not going to trust a bunch of lawyers and paper to determine what we're going to be doing in this big project.
Yeah, well, this is about studying, and if you've already done business with the people, you may have some insights. But organizational cultures can be researched. You can find what anthropologists call the kind of an internal guide, a person who knows your culture and their culture, big like that, and they can come up with unexpected expectations and demands, even at home. If you said, I want you back by 1 o'clock, said, well, okay, Mom, but then you'll pick me up at Jane's house, right? So the expectation of reciprocity can be a very important part there. So you need to study the culture. What I want to say is that the cultural competence learnings that we have need to be checked out in the individual case as best we can. And if we can't check them out, we start asking questions even after we get into it to understand what the expectations are. How long do we have to do this? Some cultures you can negotiate into the night. If
Yeah.
you're negotiating in the Netherlands at 4:30, everybody's going home, whether you're in the middle of a sentence or not. These are generalities that may be violated, but if I'm in the Netherlands and it's 3:30, I'm saying, so we've got quite a bit of stuff to go here. How long do you want to work on this today? Okay, and then can we decide what that is, and then set another meeting if we need it. So in other words, you ask questions about the other person's culture in the context that you're in.
Mhm. One thing that I can add to this, to what Dr. George said, is that, and I will call it cheat sheet or shortcut, for me at least. When I am traveling to them, I play by their rules. If they're coming to me, they play by mine. So the context is very important. And I'd like to jump on some pitfalls because, as we know, when we speak about cross-cultural negotiations, we are speaking about a great deal of room for misunderstanding. Just the element of cross-cultural negotiation is a concern for every negotiator who negotiate internationally. And you don't have to be traveling internationally. Like we stated, the negotiation can be here because of the global landscape and the ever-changing cultural makeup of societies. And two of the main misconceptions that I find on cross-cultural negotiation is that if I were to summarize it in a short sentence, a lot of people tend to underestimate cross-cultural negotiation, and most people also tend to overestimate it at the same time. So the question that I'm always asking, how can we have this seemingly paradoxical situation? Sometimes when people come to me and just say, how do I negotiate with the Chinese, an example? And that is a very hard question right now. My answer is, which Chinese do you want to talk to? One from Beijing or one from Shanghai? The one that came from the countryside to the city, or one that is born in the city and worked in the city? A young one or older one? One who studied abroad, or one who came back to China from studying abroad, or have always lived in China? So there are a lot of Chinese, and each one of these groups have different cultures beyond being Chinese, which is the national cultures. And that is the underestimation that a lot of people fall into, not knowing that within that national culture, there are actually pockets of cultures that you have to be aware of in negotiations. And the other thing is overestimating. And overestimating sometimes, for example, and I give this example in exaggerated manner, and that is, I prefer to negotiate with somebody from Catholic male in the middle of Slovenia, for example, than negotiate with somebody, a Muslim woman, professional, living, let's say in Tunisia, for example. Why is that so important? Because when we negotiate with somebody that we think is similar or has common points, we assume that we should know and understand from one another. And with that assumption and overestimating comes the risk of what I call proximity, that I have not checked everything else before coming to this meeting to negotiate or being in negotiation. And I overlook so many things, thinking that because we share these similarities, we can understand each other. And I found out so many times that is absolutely the wrong way to approach it. Now, on the other side of the coin, if with the Catholic middle-aged man engineer in Slovenia, I have checked everything, dotted all my I's, and crossed all my T's to actually know everything beforehand. So that underestimation and overestimation, it's one of the many pitfalls that we fall into when negotiating cross culture. Have you found that to be valid?
First of all, I'm going to share with you, you began by saying, is it going to be our playing field or their playing field? Okay. It's both of your playing fields. And what's going to happen is that you're going to have to see how the ground lies and how the other person plays. One of my favorite cartoons is a Western businessman is meeting a Japanese businessman. And the Western businessman comes up and says, "Mr. Yamamoto," and he makes a bow and he says, "It's an incredible pleasure to be working with you and your organization. I'm looking forward to a very good experience with you and your people." And the Japanese guy sticks out his hand and says, "Hi, Charlie, welcome to Japan." Okay. I love this cartoon because what it says is, we don't know, and we can do whatever we do and we can laugh at it sometimes, but we want to be careful that it's not injuring somebody by what we do. Now,
Mhm.
for example, you have been calling me Dr. George. That's peculiar to something in your culture. I teach in a lot of schools, and here in France, of course, it's Dr. Simons, and if I'm in Germany, it's Herr Dr. Professor Simons. In other words, I don't have any problem with your doing it, but I notice it. Okay, it's very different. It's like I tell my friends to just call me George. I get a student who raises his hand and says, Dr. George,
Well, Dr. George, this is how she introduced you. So I went with the flow. I said, okay, let me follow the flow.
Yeah. Well, you find these things out as you continue and share your expectations and try to make it comfortable for the other person. So I'm not going to expect you to play on my rules when you come to negotiate with me. I expect us to be able to get into how we understand our context, our situation, and our needs. And this is why the exploration of needs is so critically important in a negotiation. 90% of the work is exploring and understanding and coming to grips with the needs of the other person and making sure that your own needs are clearly understood and respected.
Yes, I appreciate you saying that. Would you like me to call you Dr. George or George?
Whatever you like.
Okay, well, I'll keep it Dr. George. What I meant by when I go, let's say, for example, just recently I was in Saudi Arabia for a business trip. I have to play by the rules over there, meaning I have to be patient. I have to be conscious of time. I just have to follow the rules of business conduct in there. And that's what I meant. On the other hand, when I have clients come in here, then if they don't know, they do research ahead of time of how business is done over here. So it's just that rule of thumb, if you want to say, okay, well, if I am going to anywhere in the world, I better do my research and know exactly how things are done in their playing field. And here, when people are coming here to the States to do business, they've already done their research. And I tell them, this is how we do it here. And I explain to them, this is how it is done. This is how we're doing it here. Then now when it comes to negotiation, of course, that's a process. It's not one set of event that happens. It's a process of before and during and after. And of course, is an agreement, or like you call it, a resolution where both parties are happy in an agreement. And that's what I meant by you understand their rule, you play by that rule when you go there. Then when they come to you, you tell them how it is there.
That's not necessarily the way I would approach it. I think in the preparation, you learn as much as you can. Then when you sit down together, you explore how are we going to negotiate together. For example, I may go into a negotiation with several people. Maybe the decision maker isn't there. In other words, these people report to somebody else. I
Yeah.
need to know this. How long are we going to negotiate? Who is the spokesperson? Who needs to be here from your side, from our side? It's not like we have a set of fixed rules about here's how we negotiate here. It's establishing what is this negotiation going to be like that meets the needs and gives us all the information about each other that we need to do a good deal.
Yeah, but I'm not referring to the negotiation itself. The process of negotiation is a separate thing. What I'm referring to
It's
is
a dynamic process, whereas the legal rules or That's a different, I think that's what you're talking about, right, Mona? Once you set a formal
Yes,
agreement.
like for example, I will do my homework ahead of time. Okay, who needs to be here? How long is it going to be? And all that is a part of the homework that I have to do ahead of time and ask a lot of questions beforehand.
You may not be able to do it ahead of time, so you'll have to do it when you sit down at the table together.
Granted, that's understood. The overall thing is the landscape of it all is different, and then the landscape is what you need to understand first before you. All these things that you're referring to are details of particular negotiations, which obviously are big part of getting into an agreement. But the landscape of it is different. I mean, everybody does it different, and it is my job to understand how others do it. Then the details of the transaction or the negotiation itself is a separate thing that needs a separate preparation and separate set of rules.
And what I'm hearing is that when we talk about context, which you have mentioned a few times, Mona, and you, George, you're mentioning how some stuff is unknown and you won't know till you're actually sitting there and talking to somebody if you haven't had the privilege of meeting them previously. I think that what I'm gathering is that not only is it the preparation, but being open to the observation, doing a lot of exploration, open-ended questions, picking up on vibes. A lot of it is vibes. And I think that one of the other, I think the famous author, what was it? Wasn't it Malcolm Gladwell in that book, Blink? Didn't he talk about how you make decisions with your gut? Even though we want to think that we're doing it in a very rational way, a lot of times, like I think you said, you're who you are. A lot of times it's that emotional part, like even that amygdala, that's the one that's actually driving you to make certain decisions. But I think that the whole concept of being able to pick up on the energy, being able to pick up on the subtle cues, being able to pick on a nonverbal language that might be telling you whether somebody is getting annoyed or if somebody is receptive to what you're saying. All of those things are really important. And I think that that's one of the most important factors in intercultural study is being able to have that antenna to pick up on those things and adjust accordingly. Does that make sense?
Yes, and of course, if you're negotiating as a team, after the negotiation, you go out for a few drinks and dinner and discuss what did you pick up, what did you know, because each person will have their own sensitivities. I mean, I'm not sure exactly, Mona, what you mean by a landscape, but I can have a picture of a landscape, but I get there and the picture is 10 years old, and I don't know this, or the picture is of a different kind of organization, despite the fact that I've gathered the best information I can. And I would say, Americans don't do that as nearly as thoroughly, for example, as I gave you the example of the Japanese who know the name of your dog, and stuff like that. Fundamentally, it's about being able to explore and learn as you go along. And if you make a mistake, understand the mistake and correct it and whatever, go on with the process. It's being as clear as you can about people's expectations. You don't just terminate a meeting, but you say, what are we going to do next time? And how are we going to do this? And so on and so forth. What works best for you,
Yeah.
Who do we need to talk to,
Yeah, and the type of negotiation will dictate a great deal of how things will go as well, don't you think? I mean, if you're doing high stake negotiations, it's not going to be the same as you're selling a boat, for example. We should take all of that into consideration.
Yeah. Well, I mean, every situation is different.
Yeah.
And the fact is that we need to take our time. And above all, culture is also a set of needs. So when I'm talking about identifying what the other person needs, yes, I'm talking about what will make the deal go, but I'm also realizing that cultural needs may impede or help the situation to grow as well. So that's a good part of the challenge,
Well, we are definitely enjoying your discussion, Dr. George, and we wish we have a lot more time. It seems like you have a lot of stuff to share that people will benefit from. It is definitely beyond our expected time, and this topic is quite complex. We're going to give you the last word, but what I like to tell the viewer and the listener is that in today's world, and let's face it, it's not going to get less complex especially with the advent of technology, internet, with the removal boundaries and restrictions on time associated with traveling, because you can get on an airplane and be there for your negotiation. This cross-cultural business and negotiating is not going anywhere, and it's not going to go away. It will be bigger and bigger. The global landscape is forever evolving and changing. So if you are not negotiating cross culture now, the odds are you will be pretty soon. And also, you don't have to be traveling internationally to negotiate or do business cross culture. The makeup of our societies is changing. Once homogeneous, not going to be the same. People are traveling across the world, and that part of cross cultural negotiation will be there. And you just have to get to know how to work with other people different than you are. Last word, Dr. George.
Well, one thing that I would like to say is, have you thought of this? Get on your chat GPT, give all the specifications you can about who you're dealing with, and say, let's simulate a negotiation. What do I do? What do they do? What can I expect? May be totally wrong, but it may also alert you to things that you were not aware of before and that might expect some looking into. So, if you can describe your target of negotiation and your needs and so on, run it across those kind of things. There's lots of things you can learn. We've created a game on negotiation in our Diversity series, and it's pretty basic stuff, but fundamentally it helps you think about, how do I think about the negotiation I'm going into, and what are the assumptions that I'm making, and what might I expect that's different, and so on. So this is a continually building and changing, like the negotiations themselves. The one thing that I wanted to mention before also was that the deal you negotiate and the contract you make, there's still something else to be done in the making of the contract, and that's understanding how, if you are talking to certain people in the organization, how will other people in the organization accept the agreement that you have made? Okay, in other words, they may have to sell the contract. They may have to negotiate the contract with their peers or their subordinate. There's lots of stuff there, and so be home by one is the important thing. What the conditions of that are, you have to negotiate.
Well, it's been a pleasure having you. You have a last word, Maria, before we say goodbye?
Thank you so much for being here, George. I appreciate it. Thanks for imparting your wisdom.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure to talk about this, and there's lots to explore.
Yes.
I know.
Thanks.
Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure.